Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has taken place in the week that the chickens have come home to roost for the First Minister and his failing government. On their watch, Scotland has become a high-tax, low-growth economy. Public services are crumbling, unable to cope after 17 years of the SNP's incompetence and mismanagement. Drug deaths, unmentioned by the First Minister, are soaring. Waiting times remain high. The pupil attainment gap is growing. Lifeline ferries have failed to be delivered. All of this combined to produce the SNP's reverse Midas touch, a unique ability to spend more and at the same time deliver less. And as my colleagues Douglas Ross and Liz Smith rightly said, this government has mismanaged the tax system, mismanaged public sector pay negotiations, mismanaged largely unreformed public services, and it has woefully mismanaged the public finances. And as Rachel Hamilton said, it is no surprise, therefore, that the Finance Secretary was yesterday forced to come to this Parliament to reveal a £1 billion in-year budget black hole. A black hole of the SNP's making and their making alone. A black hole that Shona Robertson conceded will have a profound effect on this government's ability to deliver public services and public service reform. And yet, the First Minister confirmed this weekend that one of the only areas to be protected from the SNP's cuts agenda is the Scottish Government's independence unit. They are still prioritising spending on party political propaganda at the expense of Scotland's patients and Scotland's pupils. Now, I listened carefully to SNP members today, to Michelle Thompson, to Stuart McMillan, Kenneth Gibson and Emma Harper, and they all played the blame game. Frankly, I do not know what is in the water on the SNP floors of this building, but there has been a sudden and severe outbreak of delusion amongst its MSPs. And contrary to... I will give way.
Michelle Thompson.
I'm merely pointing out that the macro economy resides with Westminster. And you make the point about the Scottish Government's budget. It has to operate to a fixed budget, and yet the UK Government consistently has borrowed massively, to the extent to which debt to GDP is now 88.8%. How's that for fiscal rectitude?
In part, that borrowing was to fund this country through the COVID pandemic, and in part to make sure that we are properly funding public services.
Let's hear Mr Hoy.
But Mr Swinney has been Finance Secretary for long enough to realise that he has to balance the books. But contrary to what has happened, Mr Swinney, this didn't arrive. This budget deficit did not arise by chance. It didn't arise because of Westminster. It didn't arise because of Brexit or the war in Ukraine. It arrived because the SNP government has repeatedly made a series of bad decisions and wrong calls on the pace and scale of public sector reform, on tax. No, I won't at the moment. I will come to you in a minute. No, I will come to you in a minute. I will give way if Mr Swinney can answer this simple question. Why are Scots today being taxed more when your government delivers less?
Well,
First Minister.
That's not the case because, well, in Scotland, people have eligibility for more access to early learning and childcare than in any other part of the United Kingdom. Young people get to university without paying tuition fees. Mr Hoy and his colleagues don't pay for prescription fees. There's an availability of free personal care for the elderly. That's what people get for their taxes in Scotland, which they don't get in any other part of the United Kingdom. But a question I wanted to ask Mr Hoy was this. Does he believe that the shocking economic performance of the public finances in the United Kingdom has anything to do with Liz Truss's budget, the war in Ukraine, COVID pandemic and the spiralling inflation as a consequence of Conservative decisions? Because if it has, his attack on the SNP government is absolutely fatuous.
This is John Swinney's programme for government. These are John Swinney's cuts, and he needs to own them. Presiding Officer, this is John Swinney's first and perhaps his last programme for government, and it is very thin indeed. Now, there are some elements that can be cautiously welcomed. The renewed commitment to our policy of free ports, Mr Swinney, an additional £100 million for more mid-market homes, but only after they slashed the housing budget last year. The focus on the further education sector and enhancing Scotland's skills, something long neglected by the SNP. Changes to the ministerial code so the First Minister no longer sits in judgment on himself, although I note that this Parliament will still have no role in that process. I also welcome the First Minister's renewed emphasis on reducing child poverty. Who wouldn't? But what is really going to change? How are we going to tackle the root causes of that poverty? Poor housing, poor pupil attainment and stubborn social stains, such as the effects of drug and alcohol misuse. In fact, this programme for government, as Pam Duncan-Glancy said, waters down the government's commitment to reducing the attainment gap. And in truth, 1 in 4 Scottish children are still living in relative poverty, light years away from the target of 10% by 2030 set by this government. And the government's own analysis says that the number of children growing up in poverty in Scotland today is broadly stable. In other words, despite all the extra expenditure, child poverty levels are the same or even higher than when the SNP came to power in 2007. Billions have been spent, but yet the dial is shifting in the wrong direction. This morning, the Finance Secretary appeared on radio to blame everybody but herself for her swingeing cuts. She repeatedly insisted that the SNP was investing in welfare and investing in public sector pay. Noble that this may be, but if these policies don't improve outcomes, then they are not sustainable. And if they are not sustainable, then they cannot be classed as an investment. If investment in welfare is working, why are so many Scottish children still living in poverty? If investment in public sector pay is working, why has there been no improvement in productivity or service delivery? Why has the SNP not taken on board the advice of Audit Scotland and embarked on root and branch reform of the public sector? Why is the centrepiece of this programme for government not a bold and urgent and wide-reaching public sector performance and productivity bill designed to deliver real change in the way that we deliver public services? Instead, we get the vague commitment to a 10-year reform programme. Why are NHS waiting lists in Scotland so long, given, as the First Minister says, we've avoided strikes and we pay more to our NHS staff? Because, bluntly, SNP ministers have failed to rebuild, reform and renew our NHS. In truth, this is a First Minister leading a government that is simply not up to the job of delivering reform, because this is not a programme for government. This is a programme for managed decline, or under John Swinney, mismanaged decline. Yesterday, we found out they're out of money. Today, we find out they're out of ideas. An intellectually bankrupt First Minister leading a financially bankrupt government.